We continue now at the top of Daf Yomi Gemara and Mesechet Shekalim. This is Shekalim Daf 14b. Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri says that he met up with a certain elder from the Beis Avtinas, and the person had a Megillah, the person had a scroll which had the instructions for the Ketores in it. And the individual said, this elder said, Mosternes HaMegillah Hazos Elu LaElu. In previous times, we used to give this Megillah among our family, one to the other. But now, She'enon Beis Abba Ne'emanim, where the house of my family is not trustworthy, Heilach es HaMegillah, you take the Megillah. V'hizor bo, and you, Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, you should be careful with it. Ucheshebasi v'hirtzeisi ha'devorim lefnei Rabbi Akiva. When I came and I told this in front of Rabbi Akiva, Zolgu einov demos, his eyes filled with tears. V'yamar, he said, Me'at, and now, einon utzrichin lahazkirin l'gnai. We no longer need to mention the Beis Avtinas l'gnai. We no longer need to mention them in a degrading fashion. Elazar ala paroches, the Mishnah said Elazar was in charge of the paroches. Shahaya memuna al orge paroches, meaning he was in charge of those who wove the paroches, who wove the curtains for the Beis HaMikdash. And the Gemara continues at the two dots, again quoting the Mishnah, Pinchas HaMalbush, Pinchas was in charge of the clothing of the Kohanim, Sheyamalbush Bigdei Kahuna Gedola, he used to be in charge of the manufacturing of the begodim of the Kohanim, of distributing them. Maisa b'Kohen Echad, the Gemara says there was a story with one Kohen, Shehilbish Listeratios Echad, he gave to one of the generals, V'nosan lo shmona zuvim, he gave him the clothing, these types of clothing, to one of these generals, and the general gave him 8 golden coins. Some people say he gave him 12 golden coins. And the Gemara continues with the Mishnah in Pochsin Mishiva Amarcholin Ushlosha Gizborin. When they appointed people in the Beis HaMikdash to handle the money of the Beis HaMikdash, they didn't have less than 7 Amarcholin. The 7 Amarcholin are the major supervisors, and they had 3. They couldn't be less than 3 Gizborin. Gizborin again are the people that handle the money of Hektish. So you have to have at least that many individuals handling this money. You're also not allowed to put leadership positions over the community if it's less than 2 people. You have to have at least 2 people in the position. The only exception is Ben Achia, who was again in charge of those Kohanim who developed stomach problems. He alone was in charge. He didn't have to have a partner. And also Elazar, who was in charge of the paroches, he did not have to have a partner. Because those 2 individuals, the majority of the tzibur accepted them, they trusted them. There was no need to appoint a second individual. And the Gemara begins quoting the Mishnah in Pochsin, Migimel Gizborin, Umizayin, Amarkolin, you can't have less than 3 Gizborin, and 7 Amarkolin who are above the Gizborin in terms of position. Tani, it was taught, Mishnei Kaslikin, above the Amarkolin, you have 2 people who are called the Kaslikin. So that's the hierarchy. Again, you have the Kaslikin, then the Amarkolin, then the Gizborin. And the Gemara says, Hadahu Dechsiv, this is what it says in Divrei Hayamim. This is a pasuk talking about the appointees of Yechizkiyahu in the Beis HaMikdash. It says, V'yechil, V'yuziyahu, V'nachas Gizborin. These are the names of the Gizborin. V'asal, V'yirimus, V'yozevet, V'eliel, V'yasmicheyu, Machas, V'nayu, Amarkolin. That's the names of the various Amarkolin. And then it says, Pekidim Miyad, Koneneyu, V'shimi, Achiv, Kasilkin. That those last 2, Koneneyu and Shimi, those are the Kasilkin. Again, as we said, they're the 2 that are appointed above the Amarkolin. And then the pasuk says, "B'mifkad Yechizkiyahu HaMelech v'Azaryo Negid Beis Elokim." Talks about the fact that they're all appointed under Chizkiyahu the king, and Azaryo, who was the Kohen Gadol, as the Gemara says, HaMelech v'Kohen Gadol. That last part of the pasuk is a reference to the king and the Kohen Gadol. They're obviously on top of all of those various positions. And the Gemara now explains how they handled the money and the property of the Beis HaMikdash. So first they used to put it into storehouses and they would seal the area, keshu chosem. When they would seal up the room or whatever they were using to seal up the money, hagizbor chosem, first the gizbor would put his seal on it, v'nosno la'amarkol, they'd give it to the amarkol, amarkol chosem, then the amarkol would seal it, v'nosno la'kaslikon, give it to the kaslikon, kaslikon chosem, then the kaslikon would seal it, v'nosno la'kohen gadol, give it to the kohen gadol chosem, then the kohen gadol would seal it, v'nosno la'melech, and give it to the king, ucheshu matir, and then when it came to undo the seal, when it came to take out the money, it would be in the reverse order. Hamelech roech osamo, the king would see his seal, umater, and he would undo it. Kohen Gadol roech osamo, umater, the Kohen Gadol would see his seal, and he would undo that. Kaslikin roech osamo, the Kaslikin would see his seal, umater, and he would undo that. Amarkol roech osamo, the Amarkol would see his seal, umater, and he would undo it. Gizbor roech osamo, umater, and then finally the Gizbor would see his chosim, and he would undo that as well. And the Gemara continues at the 2 dots, quoting the Mishnah, Einosin sorora latzibor b'mamon pachas mishnah. Shnayim. Again, you can't have someone in a leadership position over the congregation in terms of money without at least 2 people. Gemara says, Rav Nachman b'shem Rabbi Mona al Shem v'heim yikchu es hazav es hatcheles v'es hargamon. The reason why we know you have to have at least 2 people, it says v'heim, and they will take, when they're collecting the money in order to build the Mishkan, it says they will take the gold and the tcheles and the hargamon. So you see a minimum, a plural, a minimum of 2 people. Amar Rabbi Chama bei Rabbi Chanina says, Mipsoles shel luchos, from the extra part of the luchos were carved out of stone material, so from that extra part that wasn't used for the luchos, Hashir Moshe. Moshe kept that and he became wealthy. Hadohu dechsiv, that's what the pasuk means when it says, Psola lucho, you should cut for yourself, meaning Shnei luchos, cut for yourself, Shnei luchos, 2 luchos, avonim made of stone, meaning psol lecha, shetei psola shelcha, cut for yourself, meaning the psolas, the extra part should belong to you. That's how Moshe Rabbeinu became wealthy. Amar Rav Chanin says, Machsev shel avonim tovos u'margalios, baralo HaKadosh Baruch Hu. He gives a different explanation on the wealth of Moshe Rabbeinu. A machsev is an area where you cut stones. There was a machsev of precious stones and gems that HaKadosh Baruch Hu either revealed for him or created for him. Mitoch olo, inside his tent, umimenu hashir Moshe, and from that Moshe Rabbeinu became wealthy. Pasuk says the Gemara says along the same lines. The Pasuk says, "V'bitu acharei Moshe ad bo'o ha'ohela." It says that they used to look at Moshe Rabbeinu until he went into the tent. So Trein Amoroim, there's a machlokas 2 Amoroim. What exactly were they looking at Moshe? For what reason were they looking at him? Chad Amar l'ganai, v'chad Amar l'shavach. One says they were looking at Moshe in a negative fashion, and the other one says they were praising Moshe. Man Damar l'ganai, the one who says it was in a degrading fashion. Chamon shakin, chamon karin, chamon kopet ochel min diyudoi, v'shasi min diyudoi, kol midilei min diyudoi. They used to look at him and they would say, look at his thighs, look at his legs, look at everything that he's taking, all of what he's taking, everything that he has. They looked at his flesh. Everything that he has is from the rest of the Jews. Everything that he drinks is from the Jews. Everything that he has is from the Jews. In other words, they were looking at him in a negative fashion because all of his wealth was accumulated because of the Jewish people. Now, the one who says that the nation was looking at him in a praiseworthy fashion, they said as follows: Mechamet tzadikayu, mezaki tuvaya, dezochas lemichme yaseh. So according to that, they were looking at him and they were saying they wanted to see the tzaddik, they wanted to see the person who's zakai, the one who is pure. And they said, Tovia, it is fortunate are we, like Ashreinu, fortunate are we that we're able to see this individual, Moshe Rabbeinu. And the Gemara continues with the Mishnah. The Mishnah here is talking about the process that they used for Nesachim. When a person would bring a carbon, the carbon would also come along with Nesachim, but every kind of carbon had a different kind of Nesachim. Now, in theory, the person could bring the Nesachim from their homes, but that was problematic because the Nesachim had to be kept pure. So instead, a person would bring money to the Beis HaMikdash, he would give in the money, and then he would receive, or they would bring on his behalf, the proper Nesachim. So the Mishnah says, Dalid chosamas hayu b'mikdash. There were 4 seals in the Beis HaMikdash. These chosamas, as we're going to see, functioned as a kind of a receipt that showed that people paid for whatever particular nesachim that they required. V'chosav alei an egel, zachar, gedi, v'chote. So on each of these seals written the following words. One said egel, one said zachar, which refers to an ayil, to a ram. One said gedi, which refers to a goat. And one said chote, that refers to a mitzora, who had to bring karbanos and also brought nesachim. So these are the 4 kinds of karbanos that could be brought. Along with those karbanos would come various kinds of nesachim. So Ben Azai says, hey, hayu. There were actually 5 different chosamos. The Aramis kasav alein, and it was written in Aramaic and not in Hebrew. So it said egel. Again, egel also means the same thing. It means a calf. Dechar, again, refers, instead of zochar, it's dechar, refers to an ayil, a ram. Gedi, and it said gedi. And then there was chote dal v'chote ashir. According to Ben Azai, there were 2 different ones from Mitzorah, because he had a carbon that was brought from a Mitzorah who was wealthy, and you also had a different carbon that was brought from a Mitzorah who was poor, so you had 2 separate chosamos. And the Mishnah says further, Egel Meshamish im Nische Bakar. When it came to the chosim that said Egel, that worked with any libations that were brought with cattle, Gedolim, Ukatanim, Zacharim, and Nekevos. It didn't matter if you brought a carbon with an adult cow or cattle. It didn't matter if it was young. It didn't matter if it was male. It didn't matter if it was female. Gedi, the chosim that said Gedi, Meshamish im Nische Hatzon, that went along with anything that was in the category of tzon, of sheep. Gedolim, Ukatanim, Zacharim, and Nekevos. Didn't didn't matter, again, if it was adult, if it was young, male or female. Chutz mishel elim, except for elim, which were rams, even though those generally are considered in the category of tzon, that did not count with the chosim of tzon. They had a different shiur, a different measurement of nesachim that was brought with elim. Ayil meshamish and nischei elim bilvad. Again, the one that the chosim that said ayil, that worked with any nesachim that accompanied a carbon that was an ayil, that was a ram. And chote meshamish and nischei shalosh behemos shel mitzora. The one that said chote, that went along with the nesachim that are brought with the 3 animals that are brought by a mitzora in the purification process. Someone who has leprosy when they're purifying themselves. Mishum mevakesh nesachim. Now here's how the process worked. Somebody who wanted nesachim, holich lo etzel Yochanan shehu memuna ala chosamos. First thing he would do, he would go to Yochanan. Yochanan was in charge of the chosamos. He was in charge of these seals, which again effectively functioned like a receipt. V'nosin lo mos, he would give the money to Yochanan. Umekavel mimenu chosam. The person would then receive a chosam from Yochanan that identified exactly what kind of nesachim he needed. Balo etzel Achia, then the person went to Achia, shehu memuna ala nesachim. Achia was in charge of the nesachim. V'nosin lo chosam, he would give the chosam to Achia. Umekavel mimenu nesachim, and then he would receive the nesachim from Achia. And the Mishnah continues, Lo erev boin zeh etzel zeh. Now in the evening, Yochanan and Achia would come together one to the other. V'Achia motzias hachosamos u'mekabel kenegdon mos. And then Achia would take out the chosamos and take the money corresponding to the amount of chosamos that he had. In pichsu lo v'yashalim Yochanan mibeisa. Now if there wasn't enough money that corresponded to the chosamos, Yochanan would actually be responsible to make that up. He took responsibility from his personal property. Vim hosiru. Now if there was extra money, hosiru lehektish, hektish would get the extra money. We would not assume that extra money was given, let's say, by Yochanan by mistake and returned it to him. Instead, hektish would keep the extra money. Because as we've said before, the general rule is shayad hektish al halyona. The position of hektish when it comes to money is always al halyona. Hektish always has the upper hand. The Mishnah continues, Mishavid chosamo. Let's say somebody lost his chosam. So mamtina lo ado erev. We would wait until the evening. V'yimatzu lo kedei chosamo nosnim lo. If we found that there was some missing, in other words, they hadn't actually used all the money that was designated for the chosamos, there was some extra money, they would assume that that money goes to that person and they would give it to him. V'imlav, but if there was no extra money, lo hayu nosnim lo, they wouldn't give him any money. They would say that he lost the chosam. Too bad, he's going to have to buy another one. V'shem hayom kasav alein mipnei haramoin. Finally, the Mishnah ends that on the chosamos they would have the name of the day written on the chosamos, and that was because of the ramoyin. That was because of people who were cheaters, were afraid that maybe somebody would find the chosam that fell on a previous day, or fell from either the owner, or fell from Yochanan, whoever it was, and they didn't want to allow someone to use a chosam improperly, so that's why they always had the day that the chosam was made written on the chosam to prevent ramoyim. And the Gemara now asks, Ula ben Azai, according to Ben Azai, they have a slightly different girsa here. Chosam chote dal. The seal that is needed for a mitzora who is poor, who's bringing the carbon of a poor mitzora. Lama, what's the reason for it? What was the reason why he needed a special chosam? And the question here is because he used to bring a keves, and it used to be the nesachim that are brought with a standard keves. So he should just use the chosam gedi. That should be good enough for this particular mitzora. Why does he need a special chosam for him? So the Gemara answers the reason is mipnei shehaya mevi gam lugo imo. The reason was because the mitzora used to bring a lug of shemen in addition, because there was a special procedure that was done using the oil on the thumbs of the mitzora. That extra amount, it was a little different than the normal nesachim that are brought from somebody who has a carbon of a sheep, and that's why he needed to bring a special chosam. Now, what did the Rabbanan respond to that? Because the Rabbanan did not have a special chosam for the chote dal. So the Gemara says, Biram ki Rabbanan. However, according to the Rabbanan, mevi gedi, the person would bring a gedi, meaning according to the Rabbanan, you would just bring the chosam gedi, and that would be good enough. What did the Rabbanan do about the lug echad shel shemen for the matan bahonos? They didn't need a chosam according to the Rabbanan, because the person would bring the shemen from his own house. And the Gemara continues and asks the following question: Nischei Rachel ma? What are the nesachim for a Rachel? Now, a Rachel is a 2-year-old female sheep, and the question of the Gemara is as follows. The question of the Gemara is that when you have a 2-year-old male sheep, which is called an ayil, which is called a ram, that has more nesachim than a standard keves. So the question is, does the female keves, does the female rocha, which is 2 years old, does it bring the nesachim similar to the ayil? Or no, maybe that's only true by an ayil, but when it comes to a rochel, has the same status as the younger sheep, and it brings a small amount of nesachim. That's the question of the Gemara. And so the Gemara now tries to answer from our Mishnah. The Mishnah said, Min ma'ad taninan. Let us learn from our Mishnah, which says as follows: Gedi mishamesh nischei tzon gedolim ukatanim zecharim nekevas. It says that the chosim that was called gedi, that functioned for the nesachim of all kinds of sheep, whether they were adult, whether they were young, whether they were male, whether they were female. Hado amri, that seems to indicate nischei rochel kenischei gedi, that the nischei rochel, the nesachim that are brought for the female sheep that's 2 years old, is the same thing as the gedi. It doesn't make any difference, because again, keep in mind that ayil had a separate chosam. The ayil had a separate chosam, and that was different from the chosam that we called tzon, from the chosam that we call nischei tzon. And the nischei tzon applied to everything. Doesn't matter if it's adult, doesn't matter if it's younger, it makes no difference. So it would seem to be that when it comes to the males, we make a distinction. When you have a keves, you have a smaller amount of nesachim. That goes into the nischei tzon. And when it gets a little older, when it's called an ayil, there's more nesachim. But when it comes to the female, it makes no difference. Doesn't matter if it's 1 year old, 2 year old, it doesn't make any difference. It's always going to be the same nesachim. And the Gemara now shows that from the pasuk d'chsiv, like the pasuk says, Kacha yayasa l'shor ha'echad, o la'ayil ha'echad, o l'seh b'kvasim o be'izim. Pasuk says, this is what you do for the shore, this is what you do for the ayil, for the ram, and this is what you do for the sheep, the kvasim, whether it be goats or whether it be sheep, whatever it might be. So the Gemara now darshans and understands the pasuk. L'shor ha'echad lama nemar. What does it say l'shor ha'echad for? What does that teach us? Magid shelo chilek bein nischei egel and nischei shor. What that teaches is, when it comes to nesachim, there's no distinction between an egel, which is a young bull, a young cow, and a shor, which is an older ox. There's no distinction. Shahaya bedin, because you might have thought in the contrary. Ben hatzon ton nesachim, u ben habakar ton nesachim. You might have thought there are sheep, they require nesachim, karbanos which are tzon, and when you have bakar, when you have cattle, those also require nesachim. So imatzanu shachilek bein nischei keves lenischei ayil. Now we know there's a distinction between a keves, which is a young male sheep, and an ayil, which is an older one. So if you make such a distinction, maybe we should think there's a distinction when it comes to short as well. We'll continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Tezvav Amud Aleph.